The cold metallic click of a gun being drawn sliced through the quiet Georgia evening like a blade through silk. It was a sound that promised violence, a sound that promised finality, a sound that no innocent person should ever have to hear while sitting peacefully in their own vehicle on a public highway. The officer's face was illuminated by the strobing red and blue lights of his patrol car. His features were twisted into a mask of smug authority. His eyes were small and dark, and burning with the kind of contempt that comes from years of unchecked power. He narrowed those eyes as he aimed his service weapon directly through the open window of the black sedan. "FBI agent." He laughed. The sound was harsh and barking and dripping with derision. "That's a good one. That's real creative." His finger tightened on the trigger. Just slightly, just enough to send a message. He couldn't know that his laughter echoing through the humid Georgia air on that otherwise peaceful Tuesday evening was the sound of his own world ending. He couldn't know that the calm, composed man sitting behind the wheel of that rental sedan had spent the better part of 2 decades staring down predators far more dangerous than a small-town deputy with an inflated ego and a chip on his shoulder the size of Stone Mountain. Deputy Vance Harlan thought he held all the power in this moment. He thought the badge on his chest and the gun in his hand made him untouchable. He thought the quiet country road and the absence of witnesses gave him license to do whatever he pleased. He was about to learn in the harshest way possible just how catastrophically wrong he was. But this story doesn't begin on a roadside in rural Georgia. It doesn't begin with the click of a weapon or the flash of patrol lights. This story begins 2 years earlier, in a cell at the state penitentiary in Jackson, where a young man named Marcus Webb sat on a thin mattress and wondered how his life had gone so completely wrong. Marcus was 22 years old. He had been driving to a construction job in Florida when he made the mistake of passing through Oak Ridge County with out-of-state plates and the wrong color skin. Deputy Vance Harlan had pulled him over for a tail light that wasn't broken, searched his truck without probable cause, found nothing, and then returned to his patrol car for 63 seconds. When Harlan came back, he was holding a bag of cocaine. Marcus had never touched cocaine in his life. He'd never even seen it outside of movies. But that didn't matter. His word against the deputies. His future against Harlan's ego. He took a plea deal because his public defender told him he'd get 20 years if he went to trial and lost. He got 3 years instead, which his lawyer called a victory. Marcus didn't feel victorious. He felt erased. His fiancée stopped visiting after 6 months. His mother still came every Sunday, and every Sunday she cried. His job was gone. His apartment was gone. Everything he'd built was gone. All because one man with a badge decided he didn't like being questioned by someone who didn't know their place. Tonight, 2 years later, karma was finally arriving in Oak Ridge County, and it was wearing a gold shield. Dr. Terence Cole guided the rental sedan along the winding 2-lane highway with the practiced ease of a man who had grown up on roads just like this one. The Georgia pines rose on either side of him like ancient sentinels. Their branches were heavy with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The setting sun painted everything in hues of gold and amber and deep crimson, transforming the ordinary landscape into something almost mystical. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was a world away from the cold, sterile briefing rooms of Quantico, where Terence had spent the last 15 years of his career studying the darkest corners of human behavior. He was 42 years old. Though the silver threading through his close-cropped hair and the deep lines around his eyes made him look older. Those lines weren't from age. They were from the things he'd seen, the case files he'd memorized, the crime scene photographs that visited him in his dreams whether he wanted them to or not. Special Agent Terence Cole, FBI, Behavioral Analysis Unit. He had helped catch 17 serial killers in his career. He had testified in cases that made national headlines. He had sat across interrogation tables from men who had done unspeakable things and gotten them to confess by understanding how their minds worked better than they did themselves. But tonight he wasn't Special Agent Cole. Tonight he was just Terence, just a son coming home to see his mother. Alma Cole was 71 years old, and she was dying. The diagnosis had come 3 months ago. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors had given her 6 months, maybe less. Terence had taken emergency leave the moment he heard. But work had kept pulling him back. Cases that couldn't wait. Testimony that couldn't be rescheduled. He had promised himself he wouldn't let anything else interfere. This visit was non-negotiable. This time was sacred. He thought about his mother as he drove, his hands loose on the wheel, his mind drifting through memories of a childhood that seemed impossibly distant now. Alma Cole had raised him alone after his father left when Terence was 4. She had cleaned houses for wealthy white families in town, scrubbing their floors and washing their dishes so that her son could have books and school supplies and a chance at something better. She never complained, not once. Even when her knees ached and her back screamed and the families she worked for treated her like furniture, she would come home exhausted, heat up whatever she could afford for dinner, and then sit with Terence at the kitchen table while he did his homework. Education is the one thing they can never take from you. She used to say that. You fill your mind up with so much knowledge they won't have room left for their hate. Terence had filled his mind. He had graduated top of his class, earned a full scholarship, pushed his way into the FBI Academy when everyone said a black kid from rural Georgia didn't belong there. He had proven them wrong, again and again and again, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the time he had left with his mother. What mattered was sitting beside her bed and reading to her from the poetry book she loved. What mattered was making pecan pie together one more time, even if she could only manage a few bites. The rental car hummed along the empty road. The crickets were starting their evening chorus. Terence felt the tension of the past few months begin to ease from his shoulders. He was almost home. He didn't notice the patrol car idling in a turnout half a mile behind him. He didn't notice the way it pulled onto the highway and began to follow. He didn't notice anything at all until the world behind him exploded in a kaleidoscope of flashing red and blue. Deputy Vance Harlan had been with the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department for 15 years, and in that time he had cultivated a reputation that preceded him like a warning shot. They called him the Hammer. He had given himself that nickname in his first year on the force. After he broke a suspect's arm during an arrest that Internal Affairs later ruled justified despite 6 witness statements to the contrary. He liked the way it sounded. He liked the way people's faces changed when they heard it. He liked the fear. At 47, Harlan was built like a fire hydrant, compact and solid, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. He had a permanent scowl etched into his features, an expression he practiced in the mirror each morning because he believed it made him look authoritative. In truth, it made him look like a man perpetually constipated by his own inadequacy. His personnel file was a masterwork of buried complaints and administrative gymnastics. 11 excessive force complaints in 15 years. 11. Any other department would have fired him after 3, but Oak Ridge County wasn't any other department. Harlan's uncle was a county commissioner. His cousin was the district attorney. The Sheriff Garrett Whitmore had tried twice to build a case against him and been blocked both times by political pressure from above. So Harlan remained, and Harlan thrived, and Harlan did whatever he wanted to whoever he wanted, secure in the knowledge that the consequences would never touch him. His favorite hunting ground was this stretch of Highway 17, right at the county line, out of state plates, rental cars, drivers who didn't look like they belonged in his territory. He had a whole system worked out. The broken taillight excuse, the smell of marijuana that existed only in his reports, the bag of cocaine he kept in his glove box for special occasions, the ones where someone looked at him wrong or questioned his authority or failed to show proper fear. Tonight his partner was a rookie named Kyle Briggs, 23 years old, 3 months out of the academy. Still young enough to believe the job was about helping people. Harlan was working on correcting their misconception. Every shift with Harlan was an education in how power really worked in Oak Ridge County. Briggs sat in the passenger seat of the patrol car, watching his training officer scan the highway with the intensity of a hawk hunting mice. "What are we looking for?" Briggs asked. Harlan didn't look at him. "Anything that doesn't fit how?" The older deputy's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You know what I mean, Briggs. Don't play dumb." Briggs did know what he meant. That was exactly the problem. 3 months of riding with Harlan had shown him a pattern he couldn't unsee. The stops were never random. The targets were never varied. There was a type, and that type had nothing to do with traffic violations. His stomach turned. His academy training echoed in his head. All those lectures about integrity and service and protecting the public trust. But his academy training hadn't prepared him for the reality of being a rookie in a department where the most dangerous predator wore the same uniform he did. He kept his mouth shut. He watched. He waited. And then a black sedan with Virginia plates came around the bend, and Harlan's entire body went rigid with anticipation. "Well now," Harlan murmured, pulling the patrol car onto the highway. "What do we have here?" The flashing lights appeared in Terrence's rearview mirror without warning, and his response was immediate and automatic. 15 years of training compressed into a sequence of movements so ingrained they required no conscious thought. He checked his speed, exactly the posted limit. He had set the cruise control precisely for this reason. He signaled right, smooth, unhurried. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching softly against the loose stone. He cut the engine, turned on the interior dome light, placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread wide, palms visible, standard procedure. Make them feel safe. Reduce variables. Control the controllable. His heart rate remained steady. His breathing remained even. This wasn't fear. This was preparation. Terrence had been stopped before. Every black man who drove through certain parts of America had been stopped before. He knew the script. He knew the stakes. He knew that the wrong word or the wrong movement or the wrong expression could turn a routine traffic stop into a tragedy that made national headlines. He watched in his rearview mirror as the patrol car's door opened. A stocky figure emerged, silhouetted against the flashing lights, moving with a swagger that Terrence recognized instantly. That particular walk belonged to men who mistook authority for power and power for permission. He had seen it in suspects. He had seen it in colleagues. He had seen it in every bully who had ever hidden behind a badge or a title or a uniform. The deputy approached from the passenger side, forcing Terrence to turn awkwardly to address him. Classic intimidation tactic. Establish dominance from the first moment. Make the subject uncomfortable. Make them feel vulnerable. Terrence remained perfectly still. The officer leaned down. His name tag caught the dome light, Harlan. His face was flushed, probably from the heat, and his eyes were small and dark and roaming across the interior of the sedan with the acquisitive hunger of a man looking for any excuse. Those eyes landed on Terrence's leather briefcase in the passenger seat, lingered there, moved to Terrence's face. "Evening, ma'am," Harlan said, then caught himself with a grunt that might have been embarrassment or might have been deliberate. "Sir," Terrence noted the slip, filed it away. "Good evening, officer," he replied, his voice calm and measured and carefully empty of anything that could be interpreted as challenge or submission. "Was I speeding?" Harlan grunted again. His hand came to rest on the butt of his service weapon with a casualness that was anything but casual. His posture was aggressive, his weight forward on his toes, his body blocking the open window like he owned it. He looked at the Virginia license plates. He looked at the rental company sticker on the bumper. He looked at Terrence's face with an expression that made clear he had already decided everything he needed to decide about this stop. Inside the patrol car, still parked 30 feet back with its lights flashing, Deputy Kyle Briggs watched the interaction through the windshield. His hands gripped the dashboard. His stomach had dropped somewhere around his knees. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it before. The script was always the same. The ending was always the same, and he was going to sit here and watch it happen again because he was too afraid of what speaking up would cost him. He reached for the radio, hesitated, remembered what Harlan had said last week about rookies who couldn't keep their mouths shut. Remembered the story about the last partner who had questioned Harlan's methods. The one who was now working security at a mall in Savannah. He let go of the radio. He sat back. He watched. And he hated himself for it. License and registration. Harlan's voice carried no warmth, no courtesy, not even the pretense of professionalism. It was a command. Flat and hard. Delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. Terrence kept his hands visible. "Officer, my wallet is in my jacket pocket. The rental agreement is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now." Slowly, he narrated every movement. Years of experience had taught him that surprises were dangerous in these situations. He retrieved his wallet with the deliberate care of a man disarming a bomb. He pulled his Virginia driver's license from its sleeve. He reached across to the glove compartment, opened it with exaggerated slowness, and extracted the rental documents. He handed everything through the window. Harlan took the documents without acknowledgement. He shined his flashlight on the license, studying it with theatrical intensity, as if searching for hidden flaws in the lamination. His lips moved slightly as he read the name. Terrence Cole. He said it like he was tasting something unpleasant. "Long way from Virginia, Mr. Cole." The subtext hung in the humid air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. "You don't belong here. What are you doing in my territory? Why are you driving a nice car through a nice neighborhood when you should be somewhere else? Anywhere else. Out of my sight!" Terrence had heard this subtext 1,000 times in his life. From teachers who expected him to fail, from colleagues who questioned his credentials, from witnesses who couldn't believe a black man could be an FBI agent. The words changed, but the meaning never did. Visiting family. He said simply, "My mother lives in town." Harlan grunted. He took his time examining the rental agreement. The flashlight beam moving back and forth across the pages like he was reading a dissertation instead of a standard car rental contract. He was stretching the moment Terrence realized. Prolonging the discomfort. Making a point. "Everything appears to be in order," Terrence said mildly. "Was there a reason you stopped me, officer?" Harlan's eyes snapped up. Something flickered across his face. A flash of irritation at being questioned, at having to justify himself to someone who should be grateful just to be addressed civilly. He was not accustomed to pushback. He was not accustomed to calm, measured questions delivered without the tremor of fear. "Your right tail light is out," he said. "That's a violation." Terrence's eyebrows drew together slightly. "Officer, I inspected this vehicle before I left the rental agency in Atlanta 3 hours ago. All lights were functioning properly." The irritation on Harlan's face deepened into something darker. "Well, it's out now. Maybe it burned out on the drive. Maybe you didn't check as carefully as you think you did. He leaned closer to the window, invading the space, making his presence impossible to ignore. Either way, it's a violation, and I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. The request landed in the quiet evening air like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward. The crickets seemed to pause their chorus. Even the strobing lights felt somehow brighter, more insistent. Terence understood immediately what was happening. He had seen it before. He had studied it. He had written papers about the psychology of escalation, the way certain personality types used any perceived challenge as justification for accelerating force. Harlan wasn't stopping him for a broken tail light. Harlan was stopping him because of what he was. And now that Terence had failed to grovel, had failed to tremble, had failed to provide the submission that Harlan required to feel powerful, the deputy needed to reassert his dominance through other means. Step out of the vehicle was never just about stepping out of the vehicle. With respect, officer, Terence said, his voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying an edge of firmness beneath the courtesy. I don't believe that's necessary. You have my license and registration. Everything is in order. If there's a problem with the tail light, you can issue a citation and I'll be on my way. There's no legal requirement for me to exit my vehicle for a simple equipment violation. Harlan's jaw tightened. His eyes went flat and cold. The pretense of professional courtesy, thin as it had been, vanished completely. I didn't ask what you believe, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I told you to step out of the car, now. Inside the patrol car, Kyle Briggs felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear the exchange through his open window. Could see Harlan's posture shifting from aggressive to threatening. Could feel the situation accelerating toward a destination he didn't want to witness. He reached for the radio again. This time his hand actually closed around it. Unit 17 to dispatch, he could say. Requesting supervisor to our location. It would take maybe 10 minutes for Sergeant Patterson to arrive. Long enough to change everything. Long enough to stop whatever was about to happen. But he didn't key the mic. He couldn't. Because he could already hear Harlan's voice in his head. The words the senior deputy would say later. Back at the station, where nobody else was around to hear. You trying to embarrass me, rookie? You think you know better than me. You think your 3 months at the academy taught you more than my 15 years on the street. And then the reassignment, the cold shoulders, the whispers, the gradual suffocating isolation that came from being labeled a rat in a department that protected its own above all else. Kyle Briggs was 23 years old. He had student loans, he had rent to pay, he had a mother who had cried with joy when he graduated from the academy. The first person in their family to wear a badge. He put the radio down. He watched. Outside, the confrontation was escalating. Officer Harlan, Terence said. And there was something different in his voice now. A weight of authority that hadn't been there before. I am not required by law to exit my vehicle for a traffic stop unless you have reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. A potentially broken tail light does not constitute reasonable suspicion. I will remain in my vehicle while you issue your citation. Harlan's face flushed a deep mottled crimson. His hand was no longer resting on his weapon. It was gripping it, knuckles white against the polymer frame. You want to talk about the law? He hissed, leaning so close to the window that Terence could smell the coffee on his breath. I am the law out here. You're in Oak Ridge County now, my county. And when I tell you to do something, you do it. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked. He reached for the door handle. Found it locked. The refusal of the door to yield. This small mechanical obstacle that should not have mattered seemed to push something over the edge inside Vance Harlan. His face contorted, his breathing quickened, His entire body vibrated with a rage that had been building for years, decades perhaps. Rage at everyone who had ever looked at him wrong. Rage at everyone who had ever questioned his authority. Rage at his ex-wife who had taken the kids and moved to Atlanta. Rage at the world for failing to recognize his greatness. And now this man in his nice rental car with his calm voice and his references to laws. This man who wouldn't get out when he was told. This man who looked at him like he was nothing. Last chance. Harlan snarled. You get out of this car right now, or I swear to God I will drag you out through this window. The threat hung between them. Terence looked at the deputy's face, at the eyes that had gone feral with fury, at the hand gripping the weapon, at the vein pulsing in the thick neck. He ran the calculations that his training demanded: distance to the weapon, angle of the door, time required for various defensive responses. And then he ran different calculations, darker ones, the ones that every black person in America learned to run in moments like this, whether they wanted to or not. What happens if I comply? What happens if I don't? What are the odds I survive this encounter if I challenge him further? What are the odds I survive it if I submit? There were no good answers. There never were. The situation had been engineered by centuries of history and decades of policy, and 15 years of Vance Harlan getting away with whatever he wanted to reduce Terence's options to a set of choices between bad and worse. But Terence Cole was not just any citizen facing down an aggressive cop on a dark country road. He was a federal agent who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution. He had rights that existed not just in theory but in hard law. And he would not have those rights stripped from him by a bully with a badge and an anger management problem. "Officer Harlan," he said. And his voice was steel now, cold and unyielding. "I do not consent to exiting my vehicle. I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. I have not committed any crime beyond the traffic infraction you allege. If you disagree with my interpretation of my rights, I suggest you contact your supervisor to mediate the situation." For a long moment, nothing moved. The night held its breath. Then Harlan smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed exactly the justification he needed. "Resisting," he said almost to himself. "Now we're talking." The moment Terence saw Harlan's hand close fully around the grip of his weapon, he knew the situation had crossed a threshold. There would be no de-escalation now. There would be no reasoning. The deputy had committed himself to a course of action, and the momentum of his rage would carry him forward regardless of consequences. Terence had one card left to play. He had hoped not to play it. He had come here as a son, not as an agent, but the choice was no longer his. "Officer Harlan," he said, his voice dropping into the register he used in interrogation rooms, the one that cut through noise and emotion and demanded attention. "I need to inform you that I am a federal law enforcement officer. My credentials are on my belt beneath my jacket along with my service weapon. I am going to show them to you now." For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Harlan's face. Doubt, perhaps, or calculation. Then it was gone, buried under the rage that had become his entire operating system. "Federal officer," he repeated, and his tone made clear what he thought of that claim. "Sure you are. I'm going to use my left hand," Terence continued, keeping his voice steady, his movements telegraphed. "To pull back my jacket and reveal my badge and credentials. My weapon is holstered and will remain holstered. Do you understand?" Harlan didn't respond. His grip on his weapon had shifted, ready to draw. Terence moved with the agonizing slowness of a man diffusing an explosive. His left hand crossed to the lapel of his blazer. His fingers found the fabric. He pulled it back, revealing what lay beneath. The gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the strobing patrol lights and seemed to ignite. The eagle perched atop the shield spread its wings as if preparing to take flight. Beside the badge clipped to his belt was an ID case with his credentials clearly visible through the plastic window. And next to that, holstered securely at his hip, was his FBI-issued Sig Sauer P229. The badge gleamed, the eagle soared, the letters FBI stood out against the gold in stark, unmistakable relief. For a long suspended moment, Holland stared at the shield. His eyes traced the contours of the eagle. His mind attempted to process what he was seeing, tried to reconcile the image before him with the worldview he had constructed over 47 years of existence. Terence expected fear. He expected sudden horrible realization. He expected the kind of panic that accompanied the understanding that a career-ending, possibly life-ending mistake had just been made. What he got instead was laughter. It burst out of Harlan like an infection finally breaking through the skin. Harsh and barking and thick with contempt, he threw his head back. His body shook. The sound echoed off the pines and scattered into the humid night air. FBI, he managed between gasps of hilarity. An FBI badge? You've got to be kidding me. He shook his head, wiping his eyes with his free hand, his weapon hand still gripping the Glock. Where'd you get that? He asked. Genuine amusement coloring his voice now. Internet. Some kind of costume shop. You think I'm stupid enough to fall for a fake badge? Terence felt something cold settle in his chest. This was worse than rage. Rage could burn itself out. Rage could be redirected. But this contemptuous dismissal, this fundamental refusal to believe what was directly in front of his eyes, this was something else entirely. This was prejudice so deep, so ingrained, so absolute that it had become impervious to evidence. In Vance Harlan's world, a black man driving a nice car through rural Georgia could not possibly be an FBI agent, could not possibly be his superior in the hierarchy of law enforcement, could not possibly be someone whose word would be believed over his own. The badge was irrelevant. The credentials were irrelevant. The truth was irrelevant. Harlan's reality would bend before his beliefs would. Officer, Terence said, his voice flat now, stripped of all pretense of diplomacy. That is an authentic FBI shield. Badge number 2847. My name is Special Agent Terence Cole. I am assigned to the Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico, Virginia. If you have any doubt about the authenticity of my credentials, you are welcome to contact the Atlanta Field Office or the FBI switchboard to verify them. Harlan's laughter had subsided, but the smirk remained. He looked at the badge again, then at Terence's face, and his expression hardened into something ugly. Nice try, sweetheart, he said, and the word dripped with venomous condescension. But I've been doing this job since before you were probably out of diapers. I've seen every trick in the book. Fake IDs, fake badges, fake stories. You think you're the first one to try this? You think flashing some costume jewelry is going to scare me off? He shook his head slowly. All you've done is add a charge. Impersonating a federal officer. That's serious time. You just made my night a whole lot more interesting. The gun cleared the holster before Terence could respond. The movement was fast, practiced. The culmination of 15 years of drawing on suspects and victims alike. One moment Harlan's weapon was secured at his hip. The next was aimed directly at Terence's face. The black muzzle filling the world like an eclipse. Hands on the wheel. Harlan barked. Both of them. Terence complied. His hands returned to the steering wheel, fingers spread wide, his heart rate finally began to climb. Not from fear exactly, though fear was part of it. from the recognition that he had passed through the looking glass into a situation with no clear exit. He was being held at gunpoint by a law enforcement officer who believed he was a criminal. The truth of his identity was irrelevant because the officer was incapable of processing it. Any sudden movement could result in death. Any argument could be construed as further provocation. Any attempt to physically defend himself would be suicide. He was trapped in the kind of nightmare scenario that his training had prepared him for in theory, but that no amount of preparation could truly address in practice. The scenario where the threat came from someone wearing the same general category of badge that he wore himself. "Officer Harlan," he said, keeping his voice as calm and level as he could manage, "you are making a serious mistake. I am asking you officially to contact your supervisor or the FBI switchboard to verify my credentials before the situation escalates further. Shut up!" Harlan's voice was shaking now too, not with fear but with adrenaline, with the intoxicating rush of absolute power. "You don't get to ask for anything. You're done talking." In the patrol car, Kyle Briggs had stopped breathing. He could see everything through the windshield. The gun aimed at the sedan, Harlan's aggressive stance. The calm figure behind the wheel who wasn't panicking the way every other person Briggs had seen in this situation had panicked. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The man in the sedan wasn't acting like a criminal caught in a lie. He was acting like someone who had dealt with situations far more dangerous than this one and had survived them. For the first time in 3 months, Kyle Briggs reached for the radio with the intention of actually using it. "Unit 17 to dispatch," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Requesting supervisor to our location, Highway 17 mile marker 43. Officer Harlan has a subject at gunpoint." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Unit 17. Supervisor en route. ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes. An eternity." Outside, Harlan hadn't heard the radio call. His focus was entirely on the man in the sedan, on the FBI badge that gleamed in the strobing lights, on the calm eyes that refused to look away. "You're going to reach down," Harlan said, "with your left hand, slowly, and you're going to unlock that door. Then you're going to step out of the vehicle with your hands above your head. We're going to see just how good that fake badge looks in the booking room." Terrence held his gaze. His mind was racing through options, calculating probabilities, assessing risks. He could comply and hope for the best. He could try to talk Harlan down further. He could attempt to contact his own people, though any movement toward his phone might be interpreted as reaching for a weapon. Then he remembered. The rental car, the Bluetooth system, the voice activation. His right hand was on the steering wheel, but his thumb was positioned near the voice command button embedded in the surface, barely visible, easily overlooked by an agitated deputy focused on his own rage. Terrence pressed the button. A soft chime sounded inside the sedan, barely audible over the hum of the engines and the chorus of the crickets. Harlan frowned, his eyes darting around the cabin. "What was that?" "Nothing," Terrence said. Then his voice low but clear, he spoke to the car itself. "Call SAC Morris." "What did you say?" Harlan demanded. "I said this is your final opportunity to reconsider your course of action, officer." Through the car's speakers, barely audible but present, a phone began to ring. Franklin Morris had been special agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office for 11 years. In that time, he had managed counter-terrorism investigations, coordinated multi-state manhunts, navigated the Byzantine politics of interagency cooperation, and testified before 3 different congressional committees. He had gray in his hair, an ulcer in his stomach, and a reputation for being the kind of man who remained unflappable in the face of almost any crisis. When his personal phone rang at 8:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening showing Terrence Cole's number, His first instinct was mild annoyance. Cole was supposed to be on leave. Family matter. The man had barely taken time off in 15 years, and Morris had practically ordered him to go visit his dying mother and stay there until he was ready to come back. If Cole was calling about a case, Morris was going to be irritated. He answered on the third ring. "Cole, this better be good. I thought I told you to." The voice that cut him off was calm, measured, and carried the particular flatness that Morris recognized immediately from his own decades of training. It was the voice of a man in crisis who was not allowing the crisis to control him. "SAC Morris. I have a situation. I am currently on Highway 17, approximately 5 miles north of Oak Ridge, Georgia. I am being held at gunpoint by a deputy from the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department. His name appears to be Harlan. Badge number 112. He has refused to acknowledge my federal credentials and has threatened to shoot me." Morris sat up straight in his chair. His ulcer gave a warning twinge. His mind shifted from relaxed evening mode to operational mode in the span of a heartbeat. "Are you injured?" "Negative." His weapon is drawn and aimed at my face through the driver's window. I have shown him my badge and identified myself as FBI. He believes my credentials are fake. Morris was already reaching for his desk phone, already typing commands into his computer with his free hand. Atlanta Tactical Team, Local Law Enforcement Coordination, Legal Authority for Federal Intervention. Is the officer's weapon still aimed at you? Affirmative. Stay on the line. Keep the call open. I'm handling this. Through the sedan speakers, Morris's voice now filled the interior of the car, clear and unmistakable. It was no longer the voice of a man answering a personal call from a colleague. It was the voice of a federal special agent in charge, assuming command of a dangerous situation. "Officer Harlan," Morris said. And the sound of his name coming from the car's speakers made the deputy visibly flinch. "This is Special Agent in Charge Franklin Morris of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The man you are currently threatening is one of my agents. You have 10 seconds to holster your weapon and place your hands on the roof of your patrol vehicle. Failure to comply will be treated as an act of aggression against the United States government." The color drained from Vance Harlan's face. For a long frozen moment, Harlan didn't move. His weapon remained pointed at Terrence's face, but the confidence behind it had evaporated. His hand was trembling now. Not a slight tremor, but a violent shaking that made the muzzle of the gun waver back and forth like a divining rod sensing water. His eyes were wide. His breathing had become ragged. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the strobing red and blue lights to make him look like a man in the grip of a fever. The voice from the car's speakers had done something that Terrence's badge could not. It had shattered the bubble of Harlan's reality by introducing an element he could not explain away. A black man could have a fake badge. A black man could be a convincing liar. But the voice on that phone, that authoritative male voice claiming to be FBI, that voice belonged to a world that Harlan understood in his bones was beyond his control. You, Harlan stammered. This is some kind of trick. You called a friend. I am counting Officer Harlan." Morris's voice cut through the night like a blade. 10, 9, 8. This isn't 8. This. Harlan's weapon hand was shaking so badly now that he could barely keep it raised. "This can't be real. 7. 6. I was just doing my job." He matched a description. I was. 5. 4. In the patrol car, Kyle Briggs had his face pressed to the windshield, watching the impossible unfold. He saw Harlan's body language collapse in on itself. Saw the swagger replaced by the hunched posture of a man who had just realized he was standing on the tracks and the train was already too close to avoid. 3! Harlan made a sound. It wasn't words. It was something between a whimper and a moan. The noise of a psyche cracking under pressure. 2. The gun dropped. Not gently, not carefully. Harlan's fingers simply gave out, and the weapon fell from his hand to clatter against the gravel of the roadside shoulder. He stumbled backward, away from the sedan, his hands coming up in the universal gesture of surrender. "Okay," he gasped. "Okay, it's away. It's holstered. I mean, it's on the ground. I'm not. I'm backing away. I'm complying. Confirm," Morris's voice demanded. Terence allowed himself his first full breath in what felt like hours. "Weapon is on the ground. Officer is backing away from my vehicle." "Good. Stay where you are, Cole. I have Sheriff Garrett Whitmore patched in from Oak Ridge Dispatch. He's en route to your location now. ETA approximately 6 minutes. Atlanta Tactical Team is scrambling. Do not engage further. Keep this line open." Terence looked at Harlan, who had backed up against the hood of his own patrol car and was staring at the sedan like it contained a coiled snake instead of a federal agent. The bully had vanished. In his place was a terrified man who could feel the foundations of his entire world crumbling beneath him. He had laughed at an FBI badge. He had held an FBI agent at gunpoint. He had threatened to shoot a federal officer over a fabricated traffic stop. And now the weight of what that badge actually represented, the full machinery of the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet, was descending on him with the inevitability of gravity. His career was over. His freedom was in jeopardy. Everything he had built, every protection he had enjoyed, every assumption he had made about his own untouchability was burning before his eyes. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "This can't be happening." The headlights appeared on the horizon within 5 minutes, cutting through the darkness with the urgency of a rescue mission. A large Chevy Tahoe, its lights flashing, its engine roaring, came around the bend and skidded to a halt behind Harlan's patrol car. Sheriff Garrett Whitmore emerged from the vehicle with the slow, heavy movements of a man who had been dreading this exact moment for years. He was 58 years old, weathered by 3 decades in law enforcement, his face lined with the accumulated weight of countless compromises. He had taken this job believing he could make a difference. He had learned gradually and painfully that making a difference was harder than it looked when your own department was poisoned from within. He had known about Harlan. Everyone knew about Harlan. The complaints that were buried, the settlements that were sealed, the victims who moved away rather than fight a system that was stacked against them. Whitmore had tried twice to build a case against his deputy, and twice he had been blocked by political pressure from above. Harlan's uncle, Harlan's cousin, the web of family connections that protected monsters like Harlan and made reformers like Whitmore feel like they were shouting into a void. But this, whatever this was different. He surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a veteran. His deputy pale and shaking, backed against his patrol car like a suspect rather than an officer. A black sedan with Virginia plates. Interior dome light illuminating a black man behind the wheel who held himself with the kind of composed authority that didn't fit any scenario Whitmore could construct. And from inside the sedan, still coming through the speakers, the voice of a man who had identified himself as a federal special agent in charge. Whitmore approached the sedan cautiously, his hands visible, his demeanor carefully professional. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low gravelly baritone. "I'm Sheriff Donovan. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Before Terence could speak, Morris's voice cut through the air again from the car's speakers. "Sheriff Whitmore, this is SAC Franklin Morris FBI. Your deputy officer Harlan has just held one of my agents at gunpoint. The situation is now a federal matter. Whitmore's face went rigid. He closed his eyes for a second, a deep sigh escaping his lungs.
It was the sigh of a man who had seen this coming, who knew one of his own was a liability, and had prayed this day would never arrive. He looked over at Harlan with an expression of profound disappointment and anger. "Understood, sir," Whitmore said, his voice tight, addressing the disembodied voice from the car. He turned his full attention to Harlan. "Vance, get over here. Now!" Harlan shuffled forward like a man walking to the gallows. "Give me your weapon," Whitmore commanded, holding out his hand. "Sheriff Garrett, whoa, your weapon, Vance, now!" Numbly, Harlan bent down to retrieve his fallen Glock from the gravel. He ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and handed it over grip first, following protocol, even as his world collapsed around him. Whitmore took the weapon, checked it, secured it in his own belt. "Now your cuffs!" Harlan's eyes widened in horror. "Sheriff, you can't be serious. I've been with this department for 15 years. My uncle is—" "Your cuffs!" Whitmore repeated, his voice like ice. With trembling hands, Harlan unclipped his own handcuffs from his belt and handed them to the sheriff. The karmic justice of the moment was breathtaking. Terence watched, a silent observer to the implosion of a man's career. The very tools of his authority were being stripped from him one by his own boss. Sheriff Whitmore grabbed Harlan's arm, spun him around with surprising force, and pushed him against the hood of his own patrol car. "Vance Harlan, you are under arrest for aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer," Whitmore said, his voice ringing with grim finality as he clicked the cold steel of Harlan's own cuffs around his wrists. The man who had been laughing with a gun in his hand just moments before was now in cuffs, his face pressed against the car he used to project his power. From the speaker of her sedan, Terence could hear SAC Morris's voice. Calm and satisfied, Cole report. He took his first truly deep breath of the evening. "Suspect is in custody, SAC. Local sheriff has secured the scene." The federal hammer hadn't just fallen. It had shattered Vance Harlan's world into a million pieces. The arrival of the FBI was not subtle. Within the hour, the quiet stretch of Highway 17 looked like a scene from a Hollywood blockbuster. Black Suburbans with government plates descended, disgorging a dozen agents in tactical vests, their faces grim and all business. They moved with an efficiency that made the local department look like amateurs. The scene was cordoned off. Measurements were taken, and every inch of both vehicles was photographed. Terence finally stepped out of his car, his legs slightly stiff. The Atlanta field office SAC, a man named David Bennett, greeted him with a firm handshake and a look of deep concern. "Agent Cole," he said. "Glad you're okay. SAC Morris sends his regards and his apologies that you had to deal with this on your personal time." "It's no longer personal time, is it?" Terence replied, his voice steady. Bennett agreed, "It isn't." Vance Harlan, looking utterly defeated, had been transferred to the back of Sheriff Whitmore's Tahoe. He refused to speak, his eyes fixed on the floor. Sheriff Whitmore, meanwhile, was a man caught between loyalty to his department and the undeniable catastrophic failure of one of his own. He approached Terence and Agent Bennett, his hat in his hands. "Agent Cole, ma'am, there aren't words. On behalf of my department, I am profoundly sorry. There is no excuse for what happened here tonight. Sheriff, was this the first time Officer Harlan has had a complaint filed against him for excessive force or racial profiling?" Terence asked, his question direct and clinical. Whitmore's weary face seemed to age another 10 years. He hesitated, the politics of his position warring with the truth. "He's had a few complaints from out-of-towners mostly.
Nothing ever stuck. Vance has family in this county going back generations. People tend to look the other way. We won't be looking the other way, Agent Bennett stated flatly. The investigation began that night with Terrence giving his official statement at the now crowded Oak Ridge Sheriff's Department. The place was a hive of frantic activity. Deputies who would have barely glanced at him a few hours before were now jumping to get him coffee, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. The power dynamic had been inverted so completely it was almost dizzying. As he recounted the events, every detail precise and unemotional, he realized the case was bigger than his own assault. Harlan's laughter, his utter refusal to believe Terrence could be an FBI agent, wasn't just about him. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness. A man that comfortable with his own prejudice and power doesn't use it just once. The investigation moved with a speed that surprised even those who had launched it. Within 48 hours, the FBI had established a command center in a local hotel, requisitioned records from the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department, and begun the methodical process of disassembling Vance Harlan's 15-year career piece by piece. Terrence had insisted on being involved. SAC Morris had initially resisted. The victim of a crime investigating that crime was a procedural nightmare. But Terrence had made his case. He knew predators. He understood how they thought, how they operated, how they covered their tracks. He had spent his career building psychological profiles of the worst criminals imaginable. He could do the same for a corrupt cop. The first major break came from Harlan's patrol car. During a search of the vehicle, a technician found a small hammer tucked inside Harlan's equipment bag. It was an unusual item for a law enforcement officer to carry. Hammers were not standard equipment. They served no obvious purpose on routine patrol, unless of course you needed to break a taillight quickly and quietly to manufacture a probable cause for a stop. The second break came from Deputy Kyle Briggs. Briggs had been brought in for questioning within hours of the incident. He was young, scared, and clearly torn between his instinct for self-preservation and whatever remained of his conscience. He gave evasive answers at first, reciting the departmental talking points about Harlan being a good officer who had made a mistake. Terrence sat in on the interview. He didn't speak for the first hour, just observed, watching Briggs' body language, listening to the hesitations in his voice, noting the way his eyes would drift to the side whenever he told a lie. Finally, Terrence leaned forward. "Deputy Briggs," he said quietly. "I'm the agent Officer Harlan pulled his weapon on. I'm not from Internal Affairs. I'm not here to protect the department's reputation. I'm a profiler. I study behavior, and right now your behavior tells me that you're not afraid of what we'll find in Harlan's record. You're afraid because you watched it happen. You watched him do these things, and you said nothing." Briggs' composure cracked. His lower lip trembled. His eyes began to water. "I was 3 months out of the academy," he whispered. "What was I supposed to do? He's got connections. His uncle is a commissioner. His cousin is the DA. Anyone who crossed him got reassigned or pushed out. I have student loans. I have my mother to think about. I couldn't." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Terrence's voice softened slightly. "I understand the position you were in, but there's a difference between being intimidated into silence and being complicit in criminal activity. Right now you have a choice. You can be a witness who helps us put a predator away, or you can be a co-conspirator who goes down with him. There is no third option." The dam broke. Over the next 3 hours, Briggs described a pattern of behavior that was far worse than anyone had imagined. Harlan targeting out-of-state plates, particularly if the drivers were minorities. Illegal searches conducted without any pretense of probable cause. Cash and valuables disappearing from vehicles during those searches. The small hammer used to break tail lights when he needed an excuse for a stop. And then Briggs mentioned a name that made Terrence's blood run cold. "There was this kid," Briggs said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A couple years back, before I joined." Harlan pulled him over, searched his truck, didn't find anything. He was furious. He went back to his patrol car. And when he came back, he had something in his hand. A bag of cocaine. What was the kid's name? I don't know. Webb, I think. Marcus Webb. He took a plea deal. He's in prison now. Marcus Webb, 22 years old, serving 3 years for a crime he didn't commit. His life destroyed on a whim by a man who couldn't accept being embarrassed. Terrence sat back in his chair. The pieces were coming together. The full scope of Harlan's corruption was becoming clear, and it was worse than anyone had feared. The state penitentiary in Jackson, Georgia, sat on 100 acres of flat, featureless land that seemed designed to crush hope. High fences topped with razor wire, guard towers positioned at regular intervals. A main building that looked more like a factory for manufacturing despair than a facility for rehabilitation. Marcus Webb had been here for 2 years. He was brought to the visitation room in shackles, his wrists and ankles connected by a chain that clinked with every shuffling step. The prison-issue uniform hung loose on his frame. He had lost weight since his incarceration, the result of stress and bad food and a soul that had simply given up on nourishment. Terrence was waiting for him at a metal table, a slim file folder sitting unopened in front of him. Marcus sat down slowly, his eyes fixed on the table, refusing to look at this well-dressed stranger who had requested to see him. He had learned not to expect good news. Visitors usually meant lawyers asking for money he didn't have, or family members crying about things he couldn't change. "My name is Special Agent Terrence Cole," Terrence said. "I'm with the FBI." Marcus's head came up slowly. His eyes, which had been dull and defeated, flickered with something that might have been curiosity, or fear, or both. "FBI," he repeated. "What does the FBI want with me?" "I want to talk to you about the night you were arrested. The night Deputy Vance Harlan pulled you over for a broken tail light that wasn't broken." Something changed in Marcus's face. The resignation cracked just slightly, revealing the anger that had been buried beneath 2 years of powerless frustration. "Nobody wanted to hear about that before," he said bitterly. "My public defender told me to take the plea, said there was no point fighting it. My word against the cops. Nobody cares what happens to people like me." "I care," Terrence said simply. "And so does the federal government. Deputy Harlan made a mistake 3 nights ago. He pulled over a vehicle and held the driver at gunpoint. That driver was me." Marcus stared at him. The chains clinked as he shifted in his seat. He pulled a gun on an FBI agent. He pulled a gun on a black man driving through his territory. He didn't believe I was FBI. He didn't want to believe it. He looked at my badge, my credentials, everything, and he decided it couldn't be real because I didn't fit his picture of what a federal agent should look like. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The connection was obvious, unspoken. They were 2 black men who had encountered the same predator on the same highway, their fates diverging only because one had possessed the credentials to fight back. "He planted those drugs," Marcus said finally, his voice cracking. "I never touched cocaine in my life. I was driving to a job, a good job, construction work in Florida. I was going to propose to my girlfriend when I got back. Had a ring and everything." The words tumbled out now. A flood released after years of being damned. He stopped me. Said I had a broken tail light. I was polite. I did everything right. "Yes, sir. No, sir. Here's my license, sir." He searched my truck anyway. Didn't find anything. I could see he was angry about it. Then he went back to his car. And when he came back, Marcus's hands were shaking. The chains rattled against the table. He had this look on his face, like he'd won. He reached under my seat and pulled out this bag. Said he'd known all along I was dirty. Said people like me always had something to hide. Terence let the silence hang for a moment, giving Marcus space to compose himself. "We found something in Holland's body cam footage from that night," he said carefully. "He forgot to turn it off when he went back to his patrol car. There's audio. You can hear him talking to himself as he retrieves the drugs from his glove box. You can hear the compartment open and close. Then you can hear him walk back to your vehicle." Marcus's breath caught. His eyes widened. "You mean there's proof?" "There's proof." "And that proof, combined with the testimony we're gathering from other officers and other victims, means that Vance Harlan is going to prison for a very long time. It also means that your conviction is going to be reviewed. The U.S. Attorney's Office is already preparing the paperwork." For the first time in 2 years, something that might have been hope flickered across Marcus Webb's face. It was tentative, fragile, like a flame in a strong wind, but it was there. "I might get out." "You're gonna get out. And you're gonna have the chance to tell your story. To stand in a courtroom and look at the man who stole 2 years of your life and tell the world exactly what he did to you." Marcus put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook. The tears that came were not tears of despair. Those had run dry long ago. These were something different, something like release. The news broke like a thunderclap over a quiet valley. "Local deputy accused of framing innocent man, threatening FBI agent." The headline ran on every major news outlet within 24 hours. The story had everything the media craved: racial injustice, police corruption, a dramatic confrontation on a dark highway, and a victim whose story was so sympathetic it practically demanded outrage. Camera crews descended on Oak Ridge County like locusts. They filmed the sheriff's department from every angle. They interviewed anyone willing to talk. They dug up every public record they could find about Vance Harlan, his family connections, his disciplinary history, the complaints that had been buried and the settlements that had been sealed. Sheriff Garrett Whitmore held a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse, his face carved from stone and his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "The actions of Deputy Harlan do not reflect the values of this department or this community," he said, reading from a prepared statement. "We are fully cooperating with the federal investigation. I am announcing today a comprehensive audit of all arrests and traffic stops conducted by Deputy Harlan during his tenure with this department. Any individual who believes they were wrongfully targeted is encouraged to come forward." The flood of responses was immediate. A black family from Chicago came forward with their story, pulled over for a swerving violation that never happened, held on the roadside for over an hour while their car was searched, their 2 young children crying in the back seat as they watched their parents treated like criminals. A Hispanic couple on their honeymoon revealed that $500 in cash, their wedding gift money, had vanished from their glove compartment during a search. They had reported it. Nothing had been done. An elderly black man who had been passing through on his way to visit family described being forced out of his car at gunpoint because Harlan claimed he matched a description. No description was ever produced. No arrest was ever made. The man had been too terrified to file a complaint. One by one, the victims emerged from the shadows. 12, 15, 23. Each story worse than the last. Each story a testament to years of unchecked abuse. The FBI investigation expanded. 3 other officers from the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department were placed on administrative leave, pending review of their involvement in covering up or enabling Harlan's behavior. Harlan's cousin, the district attorney, recused himself from all related matters and announced he would not seek re-election. The federal grand jury in Atlanta convened. Witness after witness testified. The body cam footage from Marcus Webb's arrest was played for the jurors. And the sound of Harlan muttering to himself as he retrieved the planted drugs echoed through the chamber like an accusation from the grave. The grand jury deliberated for less than an hour. They returned a true bill of indictment, 12 counts in total: assault on a federal officer, evidence tampering, perjury, multiple violations of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional protections. The federal hammer had been forged.
Now it was ready to fall. The day Marcus Webb was brought to the federal courthouse in Atlanta to testify before the trial jury was a day he would remember for the rest of his life. He had been granted temporary release from prison for the proceedings. His conviction under review pending the outcome of the federal case. He wore an ill-fitting suit that the FBI had provided. The shoulders too wide, the sleeves too long,
making him look even younger and more vulnerable than his 22 years. Terence met with him in a small conference room before the testimony began. The young man's hands were shaking, his eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar surroundings. "I don't know if I can do this," Marcus said quietly. "Stand up there in front of everyone. Talk about what he did. What if they don't believe me?" Terence sat down across from him. "They're going to believe you because you're telling the truth, and because there's evidence that backs up every word you say. The audio from Harlan's body cam, the testimony from Deputy Briggs, the pattern of behavior that proves this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was who he was. But what if?" "Marcus!" Terence's voice was firm but kind. "I know what it feels like to have someone with the badge look at you and decide you don't matter. I know what it feels like to be dismissed, disbelieved, treated like you're the criminal when you haven't done anything wrong. That happened to me 3 weeks ago, on the same highway where it happened to you." He leaned forward slightly. "The difference is I had tools to fight back. I had credentials. I had connections. You didn't have any of that. You were alone. And this country failed you. But today you have the chance to take back some of what he stole. You have the chance to stand in that courtroom and tell the truth. And make sure that everyone who ever dismissed you or ignored you or told you to just accept the plea deal knows exactly what kind of man Vance Harlan really is." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "My mom used to say that the truth has a power that lies can never match. She said that even when it seems like the liars are winning, the truth is patient, it waits, and eventually it finds its way out. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is."
A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's face. "She never stopped believing I was innocent. Not for one day. Even when my lawyer told me to take the plea. Even when my girlfriend left. Even when everyone else gave up, she never did. Then do this for her. Do it for yourself. Do it for everyone who doesn't have the chance to tell their story." Marcus took a deep breath. He straightened his shoulders inside the too large suit. When he stood up, he looked for the first time since his arrest like a man who was ready to fight. "Let's do this." The courtroom was packed when Marcus took the stand. Journalists filled the gallery. The victims who had come forward sat in rows behind the prosecution table, their faces a mixture of hope and fear and long-suppressed anger. In the front row, Marcus's mother sat with her hands clasped in her lap, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Marcus raised his right hand. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then he told his story. He spoke about the night he was arrested. The broken taillight that wasn't broken. The search that found nothing. Harlan's anger. The return to the patrol car. The bag of cocaine that appeared from nowhere.
He spoke about the plea deal, the fear, the desperation, the feeling of being trapped in something designed to crush him. He spoke about prison, the violence, the isolation, the endless grinding despair of knowing you were innocent but having no way to prove it. His voice cracked sometimes, his eyes filled with tears, but he never stopped, he never looked away. And when the prosecution played the audio from Harlan's body cam, the sound of a glove box opening, the muttered words, "Let's see how this little punk likes a real charge," a collective gasp ran through the courtroom. The defense attorney tried to shake him on cross-examination, tried to paint him as a criminal looking to exploit a technicality, tried to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the drugs had been his all along. Marcus didn't waver. "I have never touched cocaine in my life," he said, his voice steady. "I have never used drugs. I have never sold drugs. I was driving to a job. I had a future. I had a life. And he took all of that from me because he was angry that I wasn't what he wanted me to be." The defense attorney sat down. There was nothing more to say. The trial of the United States versus Vance Harlan had become, as trials of this magnitude often do, a referendum on something larger than one man's crimes. It was a reckoning for years of ignored complaints and buried evidence and victims whose voices had been silenced by protections designed to shield their abusers. The prosecution built its case methodically, brick by brick. They called Deputy Kyle Briggs, who testified about everything he had witnessed during his time as Harlan's partner. They called the victims one by one, each story adding weight to the mountain of evidence. They showed the body cam footage. They presented the forensic analysis that proved the hammer in Harlan's equipment bag had been used to break tail lights. The defense, led by a high-priced attorney from Atlanta named Theodore Marsh, tried every tactic in the book. They argued that Harlan had been a dedicated officer who made a single mistake under pressure. They claimed that the body cam audio was ambiguous, that the words could be interpreted differently. They painted Terrence as an arrogant federal elitist who had provoked the confrontation by refusing to comply with reasonable commands. It backfired catastrophically. When Terrence took the stand, he was everything the defense attorney had not wanted him to be. Calm, precise, unshakable. He recounted the events of that night with the same measured clarity he had used while staring down the barrel of Harlan's gun. "You showed your badge to the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. "I did." And what was his response? He laughed. He said FBIU. He called my credentials fake. He refused to verify them through proper channels. And then he drew his weapon and aimed it at my face. The defense attorney tried to rattle him during cross-examination. He suggested that Terrence had been combative, that he had refused reasonable requests, that any officer in Harlan's position would have felt threatened. Terrence's response was delivered in a tone so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the courtroom by several degrees. I complied with every lawful request Officer Harlan made. I moved slowly. I kept my hands visible. I identified myself as a federal agent and showed him my badge. His response was to point a loaded weapon at my head and threaten to kill me. The only thing I refused to do was surrender my constitutional rights to a man who had already demonstrated he had no intention of respecting them. The defense attorney sat down. His client, sitting at the defense table in a rumpled civilian suit, stared at the floor. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, every seat in the courtroom was filled. The journalists leaned forward. The victims held hands. Marcus Webb sat between his mother and Terrence, his leg bouncing nervously beneath the table. The foreperson stood, on the charge of assault on a federal officer. How does the jury find? We find the defendant guilty. On the charge of evidence tampering, how does the jury find? Guilty. On the charge of perjury, guilty. The word fell again and again. A drumbeat of justice. 12 counts in total.
With each verdict, Harlan seemed to shrink further into himself, his face crumbling, his body collapsing inward like a building losing its structural integrity. By the time the last count was read, guilty on the charge of conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights. Vance Harlan was weeping openly, his shoulders heaving, his sobs audible throughout the silent courtroom. The jury had spoken, the reckoning had arrived. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 1 week after the verdict. In that week, the full scope of the collateral damage became clear. Harlan's wife filed for divorce on the third day. She had stood by him through the trial, sitting dutifully in the gallery, her face carefully neutral. But the guilty verdicts had been too much. She packed her bags, took their 2 children, and moved in with her sister in another state. She changed her phone number. She removed herself from their joint bank accounts. She erased every trace of him from her life as thoroughly as if he had never existed. His fellow officers abandoned him with equal speed. The men who had covered for him, laughed with him, protected him for 15 years, suddenly developed selective amnesia about their friendships. They gave interviews to the press in which they expressed shock at the revelations. They claimed they had never known. They claimed they would have reported him if they had. Carl Briggs, who had actually reported what he witnessed, was treated as a pariah. The thin blue line, it seemed, had no room for those who dared to break its code. Even when that code protected monsters. The federal courthouse in Atlanta was packed to capacity on sentencing day. Journalists from national outlets jostled for seats. The victims and their families filled the rows behind the prosecution table, their faces a mixture of anticipation and lingering grief. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans about police accountability and justice reform. Vance Harlan was led into the courtroom in shackles, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his diminished frame. He had lost weight during the weeks of trial and incarceration. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his swagger nowhere to be found. He was seated at the defense table next to his attorney, who looked like a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle and simply wanted it to be over. Judge Helena Cross entered the chamber, and everyone rose. Before sentencing, Judge Cross offered the victims an opportunity to address the court. It was a moment that the legal process rarely afforded to those who had been wronged, a chance to look their abuser in the eye and tell him exactly what he had done to them. Marcus Webb was the first to speak. He approached the podium with steady steps, clutching a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his hands. He had written and rewritten his statement a dozen times over the past week, trying to find the right words for a moment that words could never fully capture. "Mr. Harlan," he began, his voice stronger than he had expected it to be. "When you arrested me, I was 20 years old. I was driving to a new job, a new life. I was going to ask my girlfriend to marry me when I got back home." He paused, swallowed, continued. "You took all of that. You threw me in a cage with violent men. You made my mother cry every single night for 2 years. You made my father, a man who served this country in the army and taught me to believe in its laws, doubt everything he ever raised me to believe." His voice rose slightly. "You did it because you could. Because I had out-of-state plates and brown skin. Because I questioned why you were searching my truck when I hadn't done anything wrong. You thought I was nobody. You thought I wouldn't matter." Marcus looked directly at Harlan, who was staring at the table in front of him, unable or unwilling to meet his eyes. "But today, I'm not a victim. Today, I am a survivor. I survived your corruption. I survived your cruelty. I survived 2 years in a prison cell for a crime I never committed. And today, I get to stand here in my freedom and watch this court take yours." He sat down. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet weeping of his mother and several other victims. Other victims spoke as well. The family from Chicago, the honeymoon couple, the elderly man who had been too afraid to file a complaint,
Each story was different, but the theme was the same. Lives disrupted, trust destroyed, innocence shattered by a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. When the last victim finished speaking, Judge Cross asked if the prosecution wished to make any additional statements. The U.S. attorney declined, gesturing instead toward Terence. But Terence shook his head slightly. He caught Marcus's eye across the courtroom and gave a small nod. This was not his moment. This was theirs. Judge Helena Cross had presided over federal courtrooms for 30 years. In that time, she had seen every variety of criminal, killers and thieves, fraudsters and terrorists, men and women who had done unspeakable things for reasons that ranged from greed to madness to simple human weakness. But there was a special category of criminal that provoked her deepest contempt. Those who had been entrusted with the power of the state and had used that power to prey upon the very citizens they had sworn to protect. She looked at Vance Harlan, slumped in his chair at the defense table, and she felt no pity. "Mr. Harlan," she began, her voice filling the courtroom with the quiet authority of accumulated wisdom and barely restrained fury. "I have read the pre-sentencing report. I have reviewed the evidence. I have listened to the testimony of your victims, and I've come to a conclusion about who and what you are." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "You are not a police officer. You were never a police officer. A police officer serves and protects. A police officer upholds the law. A police officer treats every citizen regardless of their race, their background, their circumstances with the dignity and respect that the badge demands." Her voice hardened. "You are a predator. You used your badge as a weapon. You used your uniform as camouflage. You drove through the night looking for prey. And when you found it, you devoured it without mercy or remorse." She gestured toward Terence, seated in the gallery. "You held a federal agent at gunpoint, a man who has dedicated his life to hunting the kind of monsters you have proven yourself to be. You looked at his badge, his credentials, his face, and you decided that he couldn't possibly be who he claimed to be. Your prejudice was so absolute, your arrogance so complete, that you were willing to risk his life and your own freedom rather than accept that your assumptions might be wrong." She turned her gaze to Marcus Webb. "But that was not your greatest crime. Your greatest crime was what you did to Mr. Webb and to all the others who came before him. You destroyed lives for sport. You planted evidence because you felt disrespected. You manufactured criminals out of innocent people because your ego demanded it." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Harlan. "There is no sentence I can impose that will undo what you have done. No amount of prison time will give Mr. Webb back the 2 years you stole from him. No punishment will erase the trauma you inflicted on countless families, but I can ensure that you never hurt anyone again." She took a breath. "On the charge of assault on a federal officer, I sentence you to 20 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed by law." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "On the charges of evidence tampering and perjury related to the case of Marcus Webb, I sentence you to an additional 20 years in federal prison. This sentence is to be served consecutively to the first." Harlan's head came up. His eyes widened in horror as the math became clear. Consecutively. 40 years. For Vance Harlan, 47 years old, it was a life sentence. "Mr. Harlan," Judge Cross concluded, her voice ringing through the chamber like a blacksmith's hammer striking iron. "You used your authority to put an innocent man in a cage. You believed your badge made you untouchable. You believed that would continue to protect you as it always had." She paused. "You were wrong. Justice may be slow, but it is not blind, and it does not forget." She raised her gavel. "You will spend the rest of your productive life behind bars, thinking about every person you harmed, every lie you told, Every life you destroyed. That is my judgment. That is my sentence. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the courtroom like the closing of a door that would never open again. The U.S. Marshals moved forward immediately, taking Harlan by the arms and pulling him to his feet. He didn't resist. He couldn't. Whatever remained of the man who had once called himself the Hammer had shattered completely in the moments since the judge pronounced his sentence. He was crying, not the angry tears of defiance or the calculated tears of manipulation, but the helpless, broken weeping of a man who had finally understood that there was no escape, no appeal, no political connection that could save him. "This can't be happening," he sobbed as they led him away. "This can't be real. I was just doing my job. I was just..." His voice cut off as the door to the holding area closed behind him. The sound of his shackles dragging against the floor faded into silence. The courtroom erupted into movement. Journalists rushed out to file their stories. Victims embraced their families. The prosecution team shook hands and exchanged exhausted smiles. Marcus Webb remained in his seat for a long moment, staring at the door through which Harlan had disappeared. His mother sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders, her face wet with tears. "It's over," she whispered. "It's really over." Marcus nodded slowly, but there was a complexity in his expression that went beyond simple relief. The man who had stolen 2 years of his life was going to prison forever. Justice in some legal sense had been served. But the scars remained, the lost time remained. The fiancé who had given up on him, the job that had gone to someone else, the youth that had been spent in a cell, those things could not be returned. "It's not over," he said quietly. "It's never really over. But it's something. It's a start." Terence found him a few minutes later as the courtroom began to empty. They stood together in silence for a moment. Two men who had encountered the same predator on the same highway, their fates diverging only because one had possessed the credentials to fight back. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now you rebuild. Your conviction will be formally vacated within the month. The state is already working on a compensation settlement. It won't be enough. It's never enough, but it will help. And there are people who want to hear your story. Advocacy groups, media outlets, organizations working on police reform. Your experience matters. Your voice matters." Marcus considered this. The idea of turning his trauma into something useful, of making sure that what happened to him might help prevent it from happening to others, held a certain appeal. "And you," he asked, "what happens to you?" Terence thought about his mother, still alive but fading, waiting for him in the house where he had grown up. He thought about the cases waiting for him at Quantico, the profiles yet to be written, the predators yet to be caught. "I go back to work," he said simply. "There are always more monsters to hunt." Outside the federal courthouse, the Georgia sun hung bright and warm in a cloudless sky. Reporters swarmed around Marcus Webb as he descended the steps with his family, shouting questions and thrusting microphones toward his face. He stopped at the bottom, surrounded by his mother and father and the small army of supporters who had gathered to witness justice finally being served. He spoke simply without notes, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. He thanked the FBI agents who had believed him when no one else would. He thanked the prosecutors who had built the case. He thanked the other victims who had found the courage to come forward and add their voices to his, and he thanked his mother, who had never stopped believing in his innocence, not for one single day of the 2 years he had spent in prison for a crime he did not commit. "She gave me my life back," he said, looking at Terence Cole, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. "Agent Cole and everyone who worked on this case, They gave me my life back. But what matters more than what they gave me is what they took from him. They took his badge. They took his freedom. They took the power he used to destroy innocent people. And they made sure he will never ever be able to do it again. 6 months later, Vance Harlan sat in a federal penitentiary in Georgia. Former law enforcement officers did not fare well in the general prison population. Too many inmates with grudges against cops. Too many scores to settle. So he had been placed in protective custody. 23 hours a day in a cell barely larger than the backseat of the patrol car he used to drive.
1 hour of recreation in a small enclosed yard where the sky was visible only through a grating of steel bars. No visitors except his attorney, who came less and less frequently as the appeals were denied one by one. His wife had remarried. His children had changed their last name. The officers who had once been his friends pretended not to know him when his case came up in conversation. He was alone in a way that he had never imagined possible, surrounded by concrete and steel and the endless, suffocating weight of time. Sometimes late at night he thought about the highway, the black sedan, the calm eyes of the man he had threatened to kill, the gold badge that he had dismissed as fake because accepting its reality would have required accepting that his entire worldview was built on lies. He had been so certain in that moment that he held all the power. He had been so wrong. Terence Cole returned to Quantico 3 weeks after the sentencing. Having stayed in Georgia long enough to bury his mother, Alma Cole passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the poetry books she loved and the photographs of the son who had made her proud. In her final days, she had held his hand and told him that she knew what he had done, not just on the highway, but throughout the investigation, throughout the trial, throughout the long process of bringing a predator to justice. "You faced down a bully," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and you helped save a town. That's a legacy, Terence. That's a story worth telling." He kept her photograph on his desk now, next to his credentials. When new agents came through the unit and asked about the Oak Ridge case, it had become something of a legend in bureau circles. He would tell them the truth, that he had been lucky, that he had possessed tools and resources that most victims of men like Harlan would never have, that the real heroes were people like Marcus Webb, who had endured years of injustice and still found the courage to stand up and speak the truth when it finally mattered. And when they asked what lesson they should take from the story, he would offer 3 words that had become something of a personal mantra. Check your assumptions. The highway was still there, stretching through the Georgia pines under skies that turned gold and crimson every evening. Deputies still patrolled its length, still made traffic stops, still interacted with citizens who were just trying to get where they were going. But things had changed. The Department of Justice had imposed a federal consent decree on the Oak Ridge County Sheriff's Department, requiring sweeping reforms in training, oversight, and accountability. Body cameras were mandatory now. All footage was uploaded automatically to servers the officers couldn't access or delete. A civilian review board examined every complaint, no matter how minor. And the next deputy who pulled over a stranger on a dark stretch of road might pause just for a moment to wonder who was really behind the wheel of that car. Because karma, as Vance Harlan had learned, was not just a concept. Sometimes it arrived wearing a gold shield. And when it did, it showed no mercy to those who had shown none to others. If this story of justice and accountability resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep telling the stories that matter.